They called her aircraft scrap metal, a relic from another era that had no place in modern aviation. But when Hurricane Delilah trapped 67 people on a collapsing offshore oil platform, and every state-of-the-art helicopter in the fleet was grounded by the storm, Captain Elena Vasquez would prove that sometimes the most forgotten machines are exactly what you need for the impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Emergency Operations Center at Meridian Coast Guard Station. Buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that comes with genuine disaster. Outside, Hurricane Delilah raged with Category 4 fury, her winds howling at 140 miles per hour and churning the Gulf of Torrino into a frothy nightmare of 30-foot swells. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently as the backup. Generators struggled against the storm's assault on the power grid. Commander James Hartwell stood before the massive weather tracking display, his weathered face illuminated by the swirling red mass that dominated the screen. The hurricane's eye wall was passing directly over the Prometheus drilling platform, a massive structure that housed 67 souls now trapped 40 miles offshore. What made the situation truly catastrophic wasn't just the storm. It was the fact that Prometheus was slowly tilting into the sea. "Structural integrity is compromised," reported Lieutenant Sarah Polk, her voice tight with barely controlled tension as she studied the incoming data from the platform's emergency beacons. The northwest support column took a direct hit from debris 2 hours ago. The entire rig is listing at 12 degrees and increasing. The implications hung heavy in the salt-tinged air of the command center. Drilling platforms were designed to withstand incredible forces, but Prometheus had been operating for 37 years. Age, metal fatigue, and the unprecedented power of Hurricane Delilah had created the perfect storm of mechanical failure. The massive structure was slowly surrendering to the Gulf's relentless assault, and everyone aboard would go down with it. Commander Hartwell's jaw clenched as he processed the timeline calculations scrolling across his tablet. "How long do we have?" "Engineering estimates 4 hours, maybe 5 if the storm surge doesn't increase," Polk replied, consulting the structural analysis report streaming in from the Coast Guard's technical division. "But sir, that's assuming the remaining support. Columns hold. If we lose another primary strut." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the mathematics of disaster. The Prometheus platform weighed over 40,000 tons, and once it began its final descent toward the ocean floor, nothing would stop it. 67 people, engineers, technicians, maintenance crews, and administrative staff would disappear beneath the waves in a matter of minutes. "What's the status of our rescue aircraft?" Hartwell demanded, turning to Lieutenant Commander Patricia Reeves, the station's flight operations officer. Reeves consulted her status board, her expression growing grimmer with each line she read. "All MH-60 Jayhawks are grounded, sir. The wind shear is too severe for safe rotor operation. We've got sustained winds at 140, with gusts exceeding 170 miles per hour. The turbulence would tear any rotorcraft apart before it got within 20 miles of the platform." The MH-60 Jayhawks were the Coast Guard's premier rescue helicopters. Sophisticated machines equipped with advanced weather radar, night vision capabilities, and the power to operate in conditions that would ground civilian aircraft. They had rescued thousands of people from hurricanes, shipwrecks, and maritime disasters across the Gulf Coast. But Hurricane Delilah was beyond their operational limits. "What about fixed-wing aircraft?" Hartwell asked, though he already suspected. The answer: the HC-130 Hercules can't land on the platform, and we can't deploy rescue swimmers in these seas, Reeves replied. Even if we could get a C-130 over the target, the survivors would have to jump into 30-foot swells in hurricane conditions. It would be a death sentence. The command center fell into the kind of silence that accompanies the recognition of an impossible situation. Modern rescue aviation had been designed around the premise that helicopters could reach anyone, anywhere, under almost any conditions. The Coast Guard's fleet represented decades of technological advancement, millions of dollars in research and development, and the accumulated wisdom of countless rescue operations. Yet Hurricane Delilah had rendered all of it useless. Hartwell studied the weather projections, looking for any sign of hope in the meteorological data. The hurricane's path was erratic, but its intensity remained unchanged. The eye wall would pass over the platform in approximately 6 hours, providing perhaps 30 minutes of relative calm before the backside of the storm arrived with renewed fury. Even that brief respite wouldn't be enough for conventional rescue. Operations. "Sir," Lieutenant Polk spoke up hesitantly, "there might be one option we haven't considered." The commander turned, his expression reflecting the desperate hope of a man running out of alternatives. "I'm listening." "The HU-16 Albatross in Hangar 7, Polk said, her voice gaining confidence as she continued. "It's an amphibious aircraft, designed for water landings in heavy seas. The hull configuration might handle the swells better than our helicopters can handle the wind shear." Commander Hartwell's expression darkened. Every person in the command center knew about the Albatross, though most tried to forget it existed. The Grumman HU-16 was a relic from the 1950s, a flying boat that had been retired from active service decades ago. It sat in Hangar 7 like a museum piece, its white paint faded to yellow, its twin radial engines silent and cold. "Polk, that aircraft hasn't flown a mission in 15 years, Hartwell said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional judgment. "It's been stripped of most of its navigation equipment. The engines haven't been overhauled in God knows how long. And even when it was new, it was considered obsolete." The lieutenant persisted, consulting her historical records. "Sir, the Albatross was specifically designed for rescue operations in heavy seas. The hull can handle landing in 8-foot swells, and the high wing configuration provides stability in crosswinds. It might be our only aircraft capable of actually reaching the platform." "And who exactly would fly this antique?" Reeves interjected, her tone making clear what she thought of the idea. "We don't have any pilots qualified on the HU-16. The aircraft type has been out of service for so long that most of our aviators have never even seen one fly." Lieutenant Polk hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders. "Actually, ma'am, we do have one pilot with Albatross certification." The silence that followed was deafening. Commander Hartwell raised an eyebrow, waiting for the revelation that would complete this increasingly surreal conversation. "Captain Elena Vasquez," Polk sighed quietly. "She flew Albatross missions during her early Coast Guard career, before she WAS reassigned to station duties." The name hit the command center like a physical force. Elena Vasquez was known to everyone at Meridian Station, though not necessarily for the reasons she would have preferred. For the past 18 months, she had been relegated to administrative duties, flying cargo runs and training missions in aircraft that most pilots considered beneath their notice. Her reputation had been tainted by what the official records diplomatically called operational disagreements with senior leadership. What those records didn't capture was the truth that everyone whispered in the hallways. Captain Vasquez had been right too many times for her own good, and her superiors had grown tired of being corrected by someone they considered insubordinate. Her expertise with older aircraft types, her encyclopedic knowledge of maritime rescue techniques, and her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom had made her persona non grata among the station's leadership. Now, as Hurricane Delilah raged, outside and 67 people faced death on a collapsing platform. That same expertise suddenly seemed less like insubordination and more like salvation. Commander Hartwell stared at the weather display, watching the hurricane's relentless advance toward the Prometheus platform. In 4 hours, those 67 people would be dead unless someone found a way to reach them. Every modern aircraft in his fleet was useless against Delilah's fury. But sitting in Hangar 7 was a machine that had been designed for exactly this kind of impossible mission. The only question was whether he was desperate enough to trust the woman everyone called a troublemaker with the most important rescue operation of his career. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Elena Vasquez was 3 miles into her evening run along the perimeter of Meridian Coast Guard Station when Hurricane Delilah's first warning sirens began to wail. The sound cut through the howling wind like a knife, and she instinctively checked her waterproof watch. 1847 hours. She'd been expecting this call. Elena stared at the data streaming across her tablet and felt a familiar sensation. The same gut-wrenching recognition that had consumed her during Hurricane Delilah 18 months earlier. She was watching a preventable disaster unfold in slow motion while the people with authority to act remained blind to the obvious solution. But this time, the stakes were exponentially higher. During Camilla, 12 fishing boats had been in the coverage gap she'd identified, with 37 fishermen at risk. The Prometheus platform held 67 Swells engineers, technicians, maintenance crews, and administrative staff who had been trapped by the storm's rapid intensification. Among them were 2 female marine biologists conducting environmental compliance monitoring, a father of 4 who worked as the platform's communications officer, and a rookie engineer on her first offshore assignment. Elena knew this because she'd made it her business to know. While her colleagues focused on aircraft specifications and weather data, Elena studied the human elements of rescue operations. She knew that successful maritime rescue required more than just technical capability. It demanded an understanding of who you were trying to save and why their lives mattered. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Elena had been relegated to administrative duties, partly because of her tendency to humanize rescue statistics, to see individuals rather than numbers, and to fight harder for solutions when she understood the personal stakes involved. Her superiors had viewed this emotional investment as unprofessional, a weakness that compromised operational objectivity. Now, as she stood surrounded by emergency supplies that would be useless if there was no one left alive to rescue, Elena realized that her intimate knowledge of both the problem and the solution placed her in a unique position. She wasn't just another pilot with opinions about aircraft capabilities. She was the one person at Meridian Station who fully understood both the human cost of inaction and the technical requirements for success. Elena's thoughts drifted to the history that had brought her to this moment. The HU-16 Albatross hadn't always been a forgotten relic gathering dust in Hangar 7. During her early Coast Guard career, that aircraft had been her introduction to the realities of maritime rescue operations. She'd learned to fly the Albatross under Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Salt Mackenzie, a legendary pilot who had flown rescue missions throughout the Pacific during the Vietnam conflict. Salt had taught Elena that modern aviation technology was impressive, but it was also vulnerable. Computer systems failed, GPS signals could be jammed or corrupted, and fly-by-wire controls could malfunction at critical moments. The Albatross represented a different philosophy: robust mechanical systems, analog instrumentation, and a direct connection between pilot skill and aircraft performance that couldn't be disrupted by electronic warfare or system failures. Young pilots these days rely too much on computers, Salt had told her during one memorable training flight through a Gulf Coast thunderstorm. When the chips are down and people are dying, you need an aircraft that responds to stick and rudder, not software updates. Elena had absorbed those lessons during 17 rescue operations aboard the Albatross, including the mission that had earned her the Coast Guard Medal, Hurricane. Patricia had stranded 43 commercial fishermen. on a barrier island that was being systematically destroyed by storm surge. The MH-60 helicopters couldn't reach them due to electrical storm activity, and conventional boats were being torn apart by 15-foot swells. Elena had landed the Albatross in conditions that violated every safety protocol in the manual, using techniques that Salt had taught her for extreme weather water landings. She'd made 4 trips between the island and the mainland, each time loading the aircraft beyond its recommended capacity, each time pushing the boundaries of what the 40-year-old airframe could handle. The official citation had praised her exceptional skill and courage under extreme conditions. But what it hadn't captured was the deeper truth. Elena had succeeded because she understood that the Albatross wasn't just an aircraft. It was a tool designed by engineers who knew that rescue operations would always involve impossible choices and unacceptable risks. Now, as Hurricane Delilah approached the Prometheus platform with unprecedented fury, Elena faced the most impossible choice of her career. Every instinct she possessed, every lesson Salt had taught her, every successful rescue operation she'd flown, was screaming at her to act. But institutional authority had made clear that her expertise was unwelcome, her solutions were unacceptable, and her presence was inconvenient. Elena checked the chronometer on her tablet. 2 hours and 37 minutes until the platform reached critical tilt. In the command center, she knew that Commander Hartwell and his staff were still searching for conventional solutions, still hoping that modern technology would somehow overcome the laws of physics and meteorology. But Elena also knew something that they didn't. Sometimes the most important missions couldn't wait for permission, and sometimes the most valuable tools were the ones that everyone else had forgotten. The Albatross was ready. The question was whether Elena had the courage to risk everything on a machine that everyone called obsolete, and a mission that everyone considered impossible. As she stood among the carefully cataloged emergency supplies, Elena realized that the next decision she made would define not just her career, but the fate of 67 people whose only hope sat gathering dust in a forgotten hangar, waiting for someone brave enough to trust an old-fashioned aviation courage over modern bureaucratic caution. The emergency klaxon's piercing wail shattered the tense atmosphere of the Supply Coordination Center as Elena finished her 3rd attempt to reach Commander Hartwell by secure radio. Each time, she'd been redirected to subordinates who had no authority to make operational decisions and no interest in hearing recommendations from someone who'd already been dismissed from the crisis planning process. Elena was updating the latest structural reports from Prometheus when Lieutenant Daniels burst through the center's doors, his face pale with urgency. "Captain Vasquez, you're needed in the main briefing room immediately. The commander is calling an all-hands emergency session." The walk back to the briefing room felt like a death march. Elena could hear the controlled chaos of a failing rescue operation even before she entered the corridor. Radio chatter filled with frustrated reports, the sound of multiple conversations happening simultaneously, and the underlying tension of people who were watching a disaster unfold without any viable solutions. When she entered the briefing room, Elena was struck by how much the atmosphere had deteriorated in the past hour. The confident military bearing that had characterized the earlier meeting had been replaced by barely controlled desperation. Weather displays showed Hurricane Delilah's eye wall approaching the platform with relentless precision, while status boards confirmed what Elena already knew. Every conventional rescue asset remained grounded. Commander Hartwell stood at the PAVI, head of the table, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes showing the strain of command responsibility during an impossible crisis. Around him, the station's senior staff looked like men who were drowning in their own expertise, unable to reconcile their advanced training with their complete inability to save 67 human lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the hollow authority of someone delivering bad news. "We have received updated projections from the National Hurricane Center and the platform's engineering systems. The Prometheus drilling platform will reach catastrophic Structural failure in approximately 90 minutes. At that point, rescue operations will become impossible, and we will have to accept the loss of all personnel aboard. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena looked around the room at faces that reflected her own horror-seasoned military. Professionals who had dedicated their careers to saving lives, now forced to watch helplessly as their most sophisticated equipment proved utterly inadequate. Major Caldwell broke the silence, his voice tight with professional frustration. "Sir, we've exhausted every conventional option. The helicopter squadron remains grounded due to wind shear that would destroy any rotorcraft before it reached the platform. The fixed-wing aircraft can't execute water rescues in 30-foot swells. And our surface vessels can't reach the platform before it collapses." Elena felt the familiar surge of desperate knowledge that no one wanted to hear, but this time she couldn't remain silent. Not with 90 minutes left and 67 lives hanging in the balance. She stood up from her position near the back of the room, her movement drawing attention from officers who had hoped never to deal with her inconvenient expertise again. "Commander Hartwell, sir," Elena said, her voice carrying across the room with surprising steadiness. "There is still one viable rescue option that hasn't been attempted." The reaction was immediate and brutal. Lieutenant Commander Reeves actually rolled her eyes while Captain Morrison made no effort to conceal his exasperated sigh. Major Caldwell turned in his chair with an expression that bordered on hostility, and several junior officers exchanged glances that clearly communicated their opinion of Elena's persistence. "Captain Vasquez," Commander Hartwell said, his voice carrying the kind of strained patience that adults reserve for children who won't stop asking inappropriate questions. "We've already discussed your creative suggestions regarding obsolete aircraft. I thought I made it clear that this briefing is for qualified operational personnel." Elena stepped forward, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Sir, the HU-16 Albatross is specifically designed for exactly this type of rescue scenario. I've flown 17 successful missions in that aircraft, including operations in sea states and weather conditions that grounded conventional rescue assets." The laughter that erupted from the assembled officers was both spontaneous and cruel. Captain Morrison was the first to speak, his voice dripping with professional disdain. "Vasquez, are you seriously suggesting that we risk additional lives on a 40-year-old flying boat that belongs in a museum? That antique hasn't seen real service since before most of us were commissioned." "Furthermore," Major Caldwell added, his tone taking on the condescending quality that Elena had learned to dread, "even if that relic could somehow remain airborne in hurricane conditions, which I seriously doubt, the risk of losing both the aircraft and its pilot would simply add to our casualty count without saving anyone on the platform." Elena felt the familiar heat of institutional dismissal, but she pressed forward with the desperation of someone who could see salvation being rejected out of bureaucratic stubbornness. "Sir, I've landed the Albatross in 15-foot swells during Hurricane Patricia. The deep V-hull configuration can handle water conditions that would destroy conventional boats, and the high-wing design provides stability in crosswinds that would flip other aircraft." Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that emphasized the growing tension in the room. "Captain Vasquez, your obsession with obsolete technology is exactly why you're currently assigned to inventory management instead of flight operations. This is 2024, not 1954. We don't conduct rescue operations with museum pieces, flown by pilots whose judgment has been repeatedly questioned by senior leadership." The words hit Elena like physical blows, but what hurt more was the sea of nodding heads around the conference table. These were people she had served alongside, officers who had once respected her expertise, now united in their assessment that her ideas were not just wrong but actively dangerous. Commander Hartwell raised his hand to restore order, but his expression made clear that he shared Reeves' assessment. Captain Vasquez, your service record includes commendable rescue operations, but it also includes significant concerns about your ability to operate within established protocols and chain of command structures. The Coast Guard medal you received during Hurricane Patricia was awarded despite the fact that you violated multiple safety regulations and exceeded your aircraft's operational parameters. Elena stared at the commander in disbelief. The same mission that had saved 43 lives was now being used as evidence of her poor judgment and inability to follow proper procedures. The bureaucratic revisionism was breathtaking in its cynicism. Her greatest professional achievement had been reframed as proof of her unfitness for operational duty. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "those 43 fishermen are alive today because someone was willing to push beyond conventional limitations when conventional solutions had failed." Major Caldwell slammed his hand on the conference table, the sharp sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Captain Vasquez, you are out of line. This briefing is for operational personnel discussing viable rescue options, not for support staff to second-guess the decisions of qualified officers. Your romantic notions about vintage aircraft and cowboy heroics have no place in professional military operations." The room fell silent except for the sound of Hurricane Delilah's wind howling outside the building. Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her 2 decades of Coast Guard colleagues who had collectively decided that her expertise was not just unwelcome but actively harmful to the service. She could see fear in their eyes, but not fear of the hurricane or the collapsing platform. They were afraid of being associated with someone whose career had been destroyed for challenging authority and proposing unconventional solutions. In their minds, Elena represented everything that was dangerous about military service: the temptation to act on individual judgment rather than institutional wisdom. "Captain Vasquez," Commander Hartwell said with the finality of someone ending an uncomfortable conversation, "you are dismissed from this briefing. Return to your administrative duties and do not attempt to participate in operational planning." Again, that is a direct order. Elena felt the dismissal like a door slamming shut on any possibility of saving 67 lives. She snapped to attention despite her civilian clothes, her body responding to military training, even as her mind reeled from the systematic destruction of her last attempt to help. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I understand completely." As she turned to leave the briefing room, Elena caught sight of the countdown timer showing 83 minutes until platform collapse. In that moment, she realized that her professional relationship with the Coast Guard was over, regardless of what happened in the next hour and a half. She had been publicly humiliated, professionally discredited, and personally dismissed by every person in the room. But 67 people were still alive. And in Hangar 7, a forgotten aircraft waited for someone with the courage to trust old-fashioned engineering over modern bureaucracy. Elena walked through the rain-soaked corridors of Meridian Station with the measured pace of someone who had finally accepted the full scope of her isolation. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the hurricane's outer bands tested the base's electrical systems, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness settling over her career. She bypassed the Supply Coordination Center entirely, knowing that her official duties no longer mattered. With 83 minutes remaining before the Prometheus platform collapsed, Elena had moved beyond the realm of military protocol and bureaucratic authority. She was now operating in the space between official failure and personal conscience, place where institutional rules held no power over individual action. Elena descended the service stairwell to the base's lower level, where the forgotten infrastructure of military operations hummed with quiet efficiency. These were the spaces that kept Meridian Station functioning: utility tunnels, backup generators, and maintenance areas that officers rarely visited, but which formed the foundation of everything they took for granted. The technical archives occupied a climate-controlled vault 3 levels below the main administration building. accessible only through a maze of corridors that most personnel avoided. Elena had discovered this space during her first week of administrative exile, when she'd been tasked with digitizing historical maintenance records that no one had touched in decades. She pressed her palm against the biometric scanner, grateful that her security clearance still granted access to the technical documentation systems. The heavy steel door whispered open, revealing row after row of filing cabinets, computer terminals, and environmental monitoring equipment that maintained perfect conditions for preserving decades of aviation engineering data. Elena made her wait at Terminal 7, the workstation she'd claimed as her personal research space during the long months of bureaucratic purgatory. The screen flickered to life, displaying the Coast Guard's comprehensive aircraft database, every specification, maintenance record, and performance analysis for every aircraft that had served in the service's inventory. She pulled up the complete technical documentation for the HU-16 Albatross, tail number 2147, currently stored in Hangar 7. The files were extensive, covering 43 years of operational service, from its initial delivery in 1957 through its final active mission in 2009. Elena had studied these records obsessively during her administrative assignment, not because it was required, but because she'd needed something meaningful to occupy her mind while her career slowly died. The performance data told a story that contradicted everything she'd heard in the briefing room upstairs. Far from being an obsolete relic, the Albatross had been systematically upgraded throughout its service life, receiving new avionics, improved engines, and enhanced safety systems that brought its capabilities well into the modern era. The aircraft currently sitting in Hangar 7 was in the 1950s. Antique, it was a thoroughly modernized rescue platform that had been retired not because of technical limitations, but because of changing operational priorities and budget constraints. Elena scrolled through the maintenance logs, her eyes scanning the detailed records of every inspection, repair, and modification performed on the aircraft. The last entry was dated 6 months earlier, a comprehensive overhaul that had brought all systems to full operational status. The Albatross wasn't gathering dust in forgotten storage. It was being maintained in ready-for-flight condition by technicians who understood its value, even if the command structure had forgotten it. She pulled up the weather analysis software and began feeding in the current storm data from Hurricane Delilah. The program was designed to calculate operational parameters for various aircraft types under extreme weather conditions, taking into account wind speed, wave height, visibility, and structural stress factors. Elena had used this same software during Hurricane Patricia to prove that the Albatross could handle conditions that would ground conventional rescue aircraft. The calculations were complex, but Elena had learned to interpret the data during her years of operational flying. She input Delilah's current parameters: sustained winds of 155 miles per hour, gusts to 180, wave heights of 35 feet, and near-zero visibility in driving rain. For most aircraft in the Coast Guard inventory, the program returned red warnings indicating impossible operational conditions, but the Albatross was different. Its unique design characteristics, the high-mounted wing that provided stability in crosswinds, the deep V-hull that could handle massive swells, and the robust radial engines that delivered power even in conditions that would flame out modern turbines, allowed it to operate in environments that would destroy other aircraft. Elena's hands moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as she calculated approach vectors, fuel requirements, and rescue capacity for a mission to the Prometheus platform. The math was unforgiving but ultimately encouraging. The Albatross could reach the platform, land in the heavy seas, and evacuate the trapped personnel in 3 trips, assuming the aircraft could maintain structural integrity under the extraordinary stresses involved. The key factor was pilot skill. The weather analysis software could calculate theoretical performance parameters, but it couldn't account for the human element, the split-second decisions, intuitive adjustments, and accumulated experience that separated competent aviators from true masters of their craft. Elena knew that attempting this mission would require every technique that Chief Warrant Officer Salt Mackenzie had taught her, plus innovations that no training manual could provide. She pulled up her own flight records, reviewing the 17 rescue missions she'd flown in the Albatross during her early Coast Guard career. Each operation had pushed the aircraft beyond its official limitations, and each had succeeded because Elena had understood that regulations were guidelines for normal conditions, not absolute restrictions during life-or-death emergencies. Hurricane Patricia had been the most extreme Test 43, fishermen trapped on a barrier island that was being systematically destroyed by storm surge. Elena had landed the Albatross in 15-foot swells, using techniques that violated multiple safety protocols, but which allowed her to reach people that no other aircraft could save. She'd made 4 trips that night, each time loading the aircraft beyond its recommended capacity, each time pushing the boundaries of what the 40-year-old airframe could handle. The official investigation had criticized her excessive risk-taking and failure to follow established procedures, but 43 families had their loved ones home safely because Elena had been willing to trust her judgment over bureaucratic caution. Now faced with an even more desperate situation, she found herself in the same position, holding the knowledge and capability to save lives, but lacking the institutional authority to act. Elena accessed the real-time data feed from the Prometheus platform, watching as structural stress readings continued to climb toward catastrophic levels. The platform was now tilting at 22 degrees, just 3 degrees away from the point where gravitational forces would overcome structural resistance and begin the final collapse sequence. The 67 people aboard had perhaps an hour of life remaining. Assuming the storm didn't accelerate the destruction process, she looked at the chronometer in the corner of her screen. 74 minutes until projected platform failure. In the command center 3 floors above, she knew that Commander Hartwell and his staff were still hoping for a miracle, perhaps a brief lull in the storm that would allow helicopter operations or an unexpected strengthening of the platform's structure that would buy additional time. But Elena also knew that miracles were rare in maritime rescue operations, and that hope without action was just another form of abandonment. The people on the Prometheus platform weren't going to be saved by institutional procedures or bureaucratic protocols. They were going to be saved by someone willing to risk everything on a machine that everyone else had written off as obsolete. Elena began downloading the technical specifications she would need for the mission fuel consumption charts, weight and balance calculations, emergency procedures, and communication protocols. She copied the files to a secure portable drive, knowing that once she left the archives, she would be operating entirely outside the official command structure. As she gathered the data that would either save 67 lives or end her own, Elena realized that her 18 months of administrative exile had been preparation for this moment. Every hour spent studying the Albatross, every maintenance record reviewed, every performance calculation verified, all of it had been building toward the decision she was about to make. The institutional Coast Guard had rejected her expertise, dismissed her recommendations, and humiliated her in front of her colleagues. But the aircraft in Hangar 7 didn't care about her damaged reputation or her questionable standing with the command structure. It only cared whether she had the skill and courage to use it for its intended purpose. Elena powered down the terminal and headed for the door, carrying with her the technical knowledge that no one else possessed and the operational experience that no one else valued. In 74 minutes, she would either vindicate everything she believed about aviation courage, or she would join the 67 people whose lives hung in the balance of a decision that only she could make. Elena emerged from the technical archives carrying a waterproof case containing everything she needed to execute the most unauthorized mission of her career. The base's corridors had taken on an otherworldly quality as Hurricane Delilah's outer bands battered the facility. Emergency lighting cast long shadows. The building's superstructure groaned under wind stress, and the constant sound of driven rain against the windows created a percussion that seemed to match the rhythm of Elena's racing heart. She made her way through service passages that most personnel never used, avoiding the main thoroughfares where she might encounter officers who would question her presence in restricted areas. Elena knew every inch of Meridian Station's infrastructure. Knowledge acquired during 18 months of administrative exile, when exploring forgotten corners of the facility, had been one of her few sources of intellectual stimulation. The path to Hangar 7 took her through the base's original construction areas, past maintenance shops where technicians worked frantically to secure equipment against the approaching storm. Elena could hear fragments of radio chatter discussing the deteriorating situation at the Prometheus platform, structural readings that grew worse by the minute, weather conditions that continued to exceed all operational parameters, and the growing resignation in voices that had run out of conventional options. Hangar 7 occupied the furthest corner of the base's aviation complex, separated from active flight operations by a quarter-mile of taxiways and administrative buildings. The structure had been built in the 1960s to house the Coast Guard's amphibious aircraft fleet, but as helicopter technology advanced and operational priorities shifted, it had gradually been relegated to storage and maintenance functions. Elena approached the hangar's personnel entrance using her maintenance access codes, credentials that hadn't been revoked, because no one considered inventory management personnel a security risk. The massive steel door whispered open, revealing a space that felt like a cathedral dedicated to forgotten aviation history. The HU-16 Albatross dominated the hangar floor like a sleeping giant. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting, the aircraft possessed an undeniable presence. 43 feet of purposeful engineering, designed to operate in conditions that would destroy lesser machines. Its high-mounted wings stretched 96 feet from tip to tip, providing the lift characteristics necessary for heavy-load takeoffs from rough water. The deep V-hull, painted in classic Coast Guard white and orange, showed the scars of decades of water operations, but retained the robust integrity of military-grade construction. Elena walked slowly around the aircraft, conducting the kind of detailed inspection that had become second nature during her operational flying career. The Albatross showed its age in small details: faded paint, worn control surfaces, and the inevitable stress marks that accumulated over 40 years of demanding service, but the fundamental structure remained sound. More importantly, the maintenance logs she'd reviewed indicated that all critical systems had been brought to full operational standard just 6 months earlier. She climbed the boarding ladder and entered the aircraft's spacious interior, breathing in the familiar scent of avgas hydraulic fluid and the subtle mustiness that characterized vintage military aircraft. The passenger compartment could accommodate up to 22 survivors under normal conditions, but Elena knew that emergency rescue operations often required creative interpretations of weight and balance limitations. The cockpit was a testament to analog aviation: rows of mechanical gauges, toggle switches, and control systems that responded directly to pilot input rather than computer interpretation. Elena settled into the left seat and felt the immediate sense of connection that came from occupying a workspace designed for human operation rather than automated management. Every control was within easy reach. Every instrument displayed information that directly related to flight safety, and the entire system was. The cockpit was a testament to analog aviation: rows of mechanical gauges, toggle switches, and control systems that responded directly to pilot input rather than computer interpretation. Elena settled into the left seat and felt the immediate sense of connection that came from occupying a workspace designed for human operation rather than automated management. Every control was within easy reach. Every instrument displayed information that directly related to flight safety, and the entire system was designed to function even when electrical power, hydraulic pressure, or navigation systems failed. Elena began the complex process of mission planning that would determine whether 67 people lived or died in the next hour. She spread aviation charts across the co-pilot's seat, overlaying transparent weather tracking sheets that showed Hurricane Delilah's current position and projected movement. The storm's eye was now less than 50 miles from the Prometheus platform, with the eye wall scheduled to pass directly over the drilling rig in approximately 60 minutes. The mathematics of the rescue operation were unforgiving. The platform's GPS coordinates placed it 43 nautical miles southeast of Meridian Station, requiring a flight time of approximately 25 minutes each way under normal conditions. But Hurricane Delilah had eliminated any possibility of normal conditions. Headwinds approaching 180 miles per hour would extend outbound flight times to nearly 40 minutes, while the return journey might take as little as 15 minutes if Elena could position herself correctly relative to the storm's circulation. Fuel calculations were critical. The Albatross carried 2,840 gallons of aviation gasoline in its wind tanks, providing approximately 8 hours of flight time under standard cruise conditions. But the extreme weather would require constant power adjustments, higher fuel consumption rates, and the possibility of extended holding patterns if the platform's structural situation changed during the mission. Elena calculated that she would have approximately 90 minutes of fuel remaining after reaching the platform, enough time for one evacuation cycle if everything went perfectly, but no margin for error or unexpected complications. The passenger manifest from Prometheus showed 67 people, distributed across 3 platform levels, 31 personnel on the main drilling deck, 22 in the administrative section, and 14 in the lower maintenance areas. Under optimal conditions, Elena could evacuate all 67 in 3 trips, loading 22 passengers per flight and accepting weight penalties that would stress the aircraft beyond its certified limitations. But optimal conditions didn't exist in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. Elena would need to factor in the time required for personnel to move through the tilting platform structure, the challenges of loading passengers in 35-foot seas, and the possibility that some of the trapped personnel might be injured or unable to move independently. Elena opened her flight case and extracted the portable GPS unit she'd modified with additional weather tracking capabilities. The device showed real-time storm data that painted a terrifying picture of Hurricane Delilah's intensity, winds that exceeded the measurement capabilities of most instruments, pressure readings that indicated a storm of historical significance, and a forward speed that had slowed to just 8 miles per hour, meaning the hurricane would spend hours over the platform location. She programmed multiple flight routes into the GPS, accounting for different wind conditions, approach vectors, and emergency alternatives. The primary route would take her southeast from Meridian Station, following the coastline until she reached the platform's approximate position, then using the Albatross's weather radar to locate the drilling rig in near-zero visibility conditions. Approach phase would be the most dangerous part of the mission. Elena would need to descend through the hurricane's turbulent cloud layers, locate a 40,000-ton platform that was listing at over 20 degrees, and execute a water landing in seas that would challenge even the Albatross's robust landing capabilities. The aircraft's amphibious design allowed for direct water operations, but landing in 35-foot swells would require timing, skill, and a substantial amount of luck. Elena reviewed the emergency procedures she'd need if systems failed during the mission. The Albatross had been designed with redundancy in critical systems, dual engines, backup hydraulics, and manual reversion capabilities that allowed continued flight even after significant equipment failures. But Hurricane Delilah was the kind of storm that could overwhelm any engineering design, Regardless of how robust the construction, she checked the chronometer on her modified GPS. 58 minutes until the platform reached critical tilt. In the command center, Elena knew that Commander Hartwell was probably briefing higher headquarters on the impending loss of 67 Coast Guard personnel and civilian contractors. The official investigation would blame equipment limitations, unprecedented weather conditions, and the inherent risks of offshore operations during extreme meteorological events. But Elena also knew that investigations and explanations wouldn't bring back the people who died, because no one had been willing to risk an unconventional solution to an impossible problem. The Albatross represented more than just an alternative rescue platform. It embodied a different philosophy of aviation, one that trusted pilot skill over automated systems and mechanical reliability over computer-controlled precision. Elena secured her charts and equipment, knowing that once she started the Albatross's engines, she would be committing not just to a rescue mission, but to a fundamental rejection of the institutional thinking that had grounded every other aircraft. On the base, she was about to prove that sometimes the most important missions couldn't wait for permission, and that sometimes the most valuable tools were the ones that everyone else had forgotten. The aircraft sat ready. The storm raged outside, and 67 people continued their countdown toward death. Elena placed her hands on the Albatross's control yoke and prepared to find out whether old-fashioned aviation courage was still a match for modern bureaucratic caution. Elena had just completed her final pre-flight inspection when the hangar's main doors burst open with a sound like thunder. Commander Hartwell strode through the opening, flanked by Major Caldwell, Lieutenant Commander Reeves, and a security detail of 4 armed personnel. The harsh fluorescent lighting caught the rain streaming from their uniforms as they approached the Albatross with expressions that ranged from fury to disbelief. "Captain Vasquez." Hartwell's voice echoed through the cavernous hangar with the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "Step away from that aircraft immediately and explain what you think you're doing in a restricted maintenance area." Elena stood at the base of the boarding ladder, her flight gear secured and her mission planning complete. She had known this moment would come, the moment when institutional authority would make one final attempt to prevent her from acting on knowledge that everyone else had dismissed. What she hadn't expected was the size of the response team or the intensity of anger in the commander's face. "Sir," Elena replied, her voice carrying across the hangar with surprising steadiness, "I'm preparing to execute a rescue mission to the Prometheus platform. Current structural analysis indicates that we have approximately 52 minutes before catastrophic failure, and this aircraft represents the only viable option for evacuating the trapped personnel." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Hurricane Delilah's wind howling against the hangar's steel walls. Elena could see the calculations running behind Commander Hartwell's eyes, the recognition that she was technically correct about the timeline, combined with the bureaucratic impossibility of authorizing an unauthorized mission flown by a pilot whose judgment had been repeatedly questioned. Major Caldwell stepped forward, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his waist. "Captain Vasquez, you are in direct violation of multiple regulations. This aircraft is not cleared for flight operations. You have no authorization for this mission, and your current assignment specifically prohibits participation in search and rescue activities." Elena felt the familiar surge of institutional dismissal, but this time it was accompanied by something new, the absolute certainty that she was right, and that everyone opposing her was complicitly accepting the death of 67 innocent people. The mathematical reality of the situation had stripped away all pretense and political. Lieutenant Commander Reeves moved to Elena's left flank, effectively surrounding her with military authority. "Captain Vasquez, your obsession with this obsolete aircraft has already caused enough disruption to base operations. The decision has been made by qualified personnel that no rescue operation is feasible in current weather conditions. Your unauthorized access to restricted equipment constitutes theft of government property. Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her 20-year colleagues who had transformed into institutional enforcers, more concerned with protecting bureaucratic authority than saving human lives. She could see fear in their eyes, but it wasn't fear of the hurricane or the collapsing platform. They were afraid of being associated with someone who had chosen individual conscience over collective judgment. "Commander Hartwell," Elena said, addressing the senior officer directly, "I've flown 17 successful rescue operations in this aircraft, including missions that saved lives when conventional assets were grounded by weather. The HU-16 can handle 35-foot seas and crosswinds that would destroy helicopters. It's not obsolete, it's specifically designed for exactly this type of emergency." Commander Hartwell's face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from having one's authority challenged in front of subordinates. "Captain Vasquez, your previous operations were conducted under authorized mission parameters with proper command, approval, and safety oversight. What you're proposing is an unauthorized solo flight into hurricane conditions that violate every operational safety standard in Coast Guard regulations." Elena pulled out her portable GPS unit and held it up so everyone could see the real-time data streaming across its screen. "Sir, this shows current conditions at the platform location. The Albatross can operate in these parameters. I have the technical specifications, weather analysis, and flight planning data to prove that this mission is not only feasible but necessary." Major Caldwell stepped closer, his voice taking on the harsh tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Captain Vasquez, even if that antique could somehow reach the platform, which every qualified aviator on this base considers impossible, you would be risking not just your own life but potentially compromising any future rescue attempts if your aircraft goes down and creates additional search requirements. Furthermore," Lieutenant Commander Reeves added, her voice cutting through the hangar's ambient noise, "your current mental state and decision-making capacity have been called into question by senior leadership. The psychological evaluation recommended after your disciplinary actions specifically noted concerns about your tendency toward inappropriate risk-taking and failure to accept institutional guidance." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Her 18 months of administrative exile were being reframed not as the result of being right at inconvenient times, but as evidence of psychological instability and poor judgment. The bureaucratic machine had found a way to pathologize competence and criminalize courage. Elena looked directly at Commander Hartwell, recognizing that this conversation would define not just the next hour, but the rest of her life. "Sir, I have documented proof that this aircraft can execute the mission safely. I have the operational experience and technical knowledge required. And I have 51 minutes to save 67 people who will die if someone doesn't act." "Captain Vasquez," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the finality of institutional judgment, "you are hereby ordered to step away from that aircraft and submit to escort back to base headquarters. You will be confined to quarters pending a full investigation of your unauthorized access to restricted equipment and your apparent intent to steal government property." The security personnel moved closer, their hands positioned near their weapons. In the universal gesture of law enforcement, preparing for potential resistance, Elena realized that she had reached the point where military authority and individual conscience could no longer coexist, where following orders meant accepting the death of 67 people, and saving those lives meant accepting the destruction of her career and possibly her freedom. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "I respectfully decline to comply with that order." The hangar fell silent except for the storm's relentless assault on the building's structure. Elena could see shock and disbelief in the faces surrounding her, the recognition that someone had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Choosing personal conviction over institutional obedience. Commander, Hartwell stared at her with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a fundamental breakdown in military discipline. "Captain Vasquez, you are committing career suicide. Even if you somehow survive this unauthorized mission, you will face court-martial for theft of government property, disobedience of direct orders, and reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment." Elena felt a strange sense of peace settle over her as she accepted the full implications of her decision. Her Coast Guard career was over regardless of what happened in the next hour. The only question was whether it would end with the death of 67 people she could have saved, or with the knowledge that she had risked everything to give them a chance at life. "Sir," she said, climbing the boarding ladder toward the Albatross's cockpit, "some things are more important than careers." Behind her, she could hear Commander Hartwell ordering the security team to prevent her from starting the aircraft's engines. But Elena had already reached the cockpit and was initiating the startup sequence that would either vindicate everything she believed about aviation courage or end her life in the attempt to prove that individual conscience could still triumph. Over institutional failure, the Albatross's engines coughed to life with the throaty roar of radio power, drowning out the shouts of authority figures who had chosen bureaucratic safety over human rescue. In 49 minutes, Elena would either be a hero or a cautionary tale, but she would not be someone who stood by and watched while 67 people died because no one else had been willing to trust old-fashioned courage over modern regulations. Twin Pratt & Whitney R1820 radial engines of the Albatross thundered to life with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of Hangar 7. Elena's hands moved across the instrument panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this startup sequence hundreds of times, but never under circumstances where armed security personnel were positioning themselves to prevent her departure. Through the cockpit windows, she could see Commander Hartwell gesturing frantically at the hangar's control systems, obviously attempting to prevent the massive doors from opening. Major Caldwell had positioned himself directly in front of the aircraft's nose, his arms spread wide in what Elena recognized as a desperate attempt to physically block her taxi path. The security detail was spreading out around the hangar perimeter, their weapons now drawn and pointed in her direction. Elena engaged the hangar door controls from the aircraft's communication panel, a legacy system that allowed direct interface with ground support equipment. The massive steel doors began their slow grinding motion despite Hartwell's attempts to override them from the external control station. Hurricane Delilah's full fury immediately invaded the hangar as 40-foot doors opened to reveal a world transformed by meteorological violence. The scene outside was apocalyptic. Rain drove horizontally across the tarmac with such intensity that visibility dropped to near zero beyond 50 feet. Emergency vehicles had been abandoned where they stood, their flashing lights creating surreal patterns in the storm-driven darkness. Debris flew through the air like projectiles, pieces of roofing material, maintenance equipment, and unidentifiable objects torn loose by winds that now exceeded 160 miles per hour. Elena throttled up the engines, feeling the Albatross strain against its wheel chocks as 40,000 pounds of aircraft tested its restraints. She could see Major Caldwell shouting something at her through the cockpit glass, but his words were lost in the overwhelming sound of radial engines at takeoff power. Behind him, the security personnel had taken cover behind maintenance equipment. Recognizing that the spinning propellers made any approach to the aircraft suicidally dangerous, the radio crackled to life with Commander Hartwell's voice, transmitted on the emergency frequency that Elena had been monitoring throughout the crisis. "Captain Vasquez, this is your final warning. Shut down those engines immediately and submit to arrest. You are committing multiple felonies and endangering the lives of base personnel." Elena keyed her microphone, knowing that this would be the last time she communicated with Meridian Station as a member of the Coast Guard. "Commander Hartwell, this is Captain Elena Vasquez in Coast Guard 2147. I am departing on an emergency rescue mission to the Prometheus platform. 47 minutes remain until structural collapse. I will maintain radio contact and provide mission updates as conditions permit. She released the wheel chocks using the aircraft's pneumatic system, feeling the albatross surge forward with the eager power of a machine finally freed to fulfill its designed purpose. Major Caldwell dove aside as the aircraft began its taxi toward the hangar opening, his face showing the mixture of horror and disbelief that comes with witnessing the complete breakdown of institutional authority. Elena guided the albatross through the hangar doors and onto the storm-lashed tarmac of Meridian Station. The aircraft immediately began bucking and swaying as Hurricane Delilah's crosswinds tested every aspect of its structural design. Elena could feel the tremendous forces acting on the high-mounted wing, trying to flip the aircraft or drive it off the taxiway into the surrounding buildings and parked vehicles. But the albatross had been designed for exactly these conditions. Its low center of gravity and wide landing gear stance provided stability that would have been impossible in conventional aircraft, while the robust control surfaces responded to Elena's inputs even in wind conditions that exceeded most aircraft's operational limitations. Each gust that struck the aircraft was met by immediate corrections from someone who understood that flying in hurricane conditions was as much about anticipation and rhythm as it was about mechanical control. Elena followed the taxiway toward the base's primary runway, using the aircraft's weather radar to navigate through visibility that dropped to zero between lightning flashes. The radar showed the full extent of Hurricane Delilah's fury, a solid wall of precipitation and turbulence that extended from ground level to over 40,000 feet. No conventional aircraft could have survived entry into such conditions. But the albatross had been engineered by people who understood that rescue operations often required flying through weather that would destroy lesser machines. The runway approach was a nightmare of crosswinds, debris, and visibility that fluctuated between 50 feet and absolute zero. Elena could see emergency vehicles with flashing lights positioned along the runway edges, crash trucks and ambulances that had been deployed to respond to what everyone expected would be a catastrophic accident. Through her headset, she could hear radio chatter between ground control and the emergency response teams, their voices tight with the anticipation of witnessing a disaster. Elena aligned the albatross with the runway centerline using instruments. Alone, the external visual references having disappeared completely in the driving rain and darkness. The aircraft's engines were now at full military power, their combined 1,400 horsepower straining against the headwinds that were pushing back against every attempt at forward motion. She could feel the airframe flexing under the tremendous stresses, but the robust construction that had been designed for carrier operations and heavy weather flying held together, despite forces that would have torn apart modern composite aircraft. Takeoff roll began with Elena fighting to maintain directional control as crosswinds tried to push the albatross off the runway and into the surrounding terrain. The aircraft accelerated with agonizing slowness, its progress measured in feet, rather than the usual rapid advancement toward rotation speed. Elena could see the runway end markers approaching through brief breaks in the precipitation, but the airspeed indicator was climbing too slowly for comfort. At what would normally have been rotation speed, Elena held the albatross on the ground, knowing that premature liftoff in these conditions would result in an immediate stall and crash. She needed every possible knot of airspeed before committing the aircraft to flight in conditions that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic possibility. The runway end grew larger in her windscreen as precious seconds ticked away, but the airspeed indicator finally showed the numbers she needed. Elena pulled back on the control yoke, feeling the albatross reluctantly leave the ground and enter the three-dimensional chaos of Hurricane Delilah's lower atmosphere. The aircraft immediately began a violent dance with atmospheric forces that seemed determined to destroy it, updrafts that slammed the aircraft upward with crushing G-forces, downdrafts that tried to drive it back into the ground, and crosswinds that threatened to flip it inverted despite Elena's constant control inputs. But the Albatross held together, its 40-year-old engineering proving superior to modern, computer-designed aircraft that relied on perfect conditions and automated systems. Elena climbed through the storm's lower layers using instruments alone, her hands and feet working constantly to maintain control as the aircraft bucked and rolled through turbulence that exceeded anything in her previous experience. At 3,000 feet, she broke through the worst of the surface turbulence and entered the relative stability of Hurricane Delilah's middle atmosphere. The storm was still incredibly violent, but the consistent wind patterns allowed Elena to establish a rough heading toward the Prometheus platform. Through brief breaks in the cloud cover, she could see the Gulf of Torrino transformed into a seething cauldron of white-capped waves that stretched to the horizon. Elena keyed her radio one final time to Meridian Station, knowing that she had now passed the point where return was possible. Meridian Base, this is Coast Guard, 2147. I have successfully departed your airspace and am proceeding to the rescue coordinates. 44 minutes remain until platform collapse. I will contact you again when I reach the survivors. Behind her. Meridian Station continued its preparations for the official explanation of how 67 people had died because no viable rescue options existed. Ahead of her, the Prometheus platform waited in the eye of the storm, its structure failing by degrees as Elena raced against time and weather to prove that sometimes individual courage was more powerful than institutional caution. The Albatross flew into the heart of Hurricane Delilah, carrying the hopes of 67 strangers and the vindication of a pilot whose only crime had been believing that old-fashioned aviation skill could still accomplish the impossible. 38 minutes before the Prometheus platform's projected collapse, Elena spotted the first visual confirmation of her target through a brief gap in Hurricane Delilah's cloud cover. The massive drilling structure appeared like a wounded giant against the storm-torn seascape, its emergency lighting creating an orange glow that pulsed through the driving rain. Even from 5 miles away, Elena could see that the platform was listing severely, its northwest corner dipping toward waves that crashed over the lower decks with increasing frequency. The Albatross descended through layers of turbulence that would have destroyed any other aircraft in the Coast Guard inventory. Elena's hands moved constantly across the control surfaces, making microsecond adjustments that kept the 40-year-old aircraft stable in atmospheric conditions that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic possibility. The aircraft's weather radar showed a solid wall of precipitation surrounding the platform, but Elena had spotted a narrow corridor of slightly reduced intensity that might allow for a survivable approach. As she closed the distance to the platform, Elena could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding below. The Prometheus was tilting at nearly 27 degrees now, its massive support columns twisted and buckled under forces they had never been designed to withstand. Waves that Elena estimated at 40 feet were sweeping across the platform's lower levels, while debris from damaged equipment created a hazardous obstacle course around the structure's perimeter. Most critically, Elena could see human figures moving on the platform's upper levels, bright orange survival suits that stood out against the gray metal of the drilling deck. The trapped personnel were alive, but their time was measured in minutes rather than hours. The platform's tilt was accelerating as structural supports continued to fail, and each massive wave that struck the listing structure drove it closer to the point of catastrophic collapse. Elena established radio contact with the platform's emergency communication system, her voice cutting through the static of atmospheric interference. Prometheus platform. This is Coast Guard Rescue Aircraft 2147. I am approaching from the northwest for emergency evacuation. What is your current personnel status and evacuation readiness? The response came through layers of electronic distortion, but Elena could hear the desperate relief in the platform supervisor's voice. Coast Guard 2147, this is Prometheus Emergency Control. We have 67 personnel ready for immediate evacuation. Platform stability is critical. We're showing structural failure indicators across all primary supports. How long until you can begin personnel transfer? Elena studied the sea state around the platform, calculating approach vectors and landing zones in conditions that no training manual had ever addressed. The waves were mountainous, but they followed predictable patterns that an experienced pilot could use to time a water landing. More challenging was the debris field surrounding the platform: twisted metal, broken equipment, and oil slicks that could damage the Albatross's hull during water operations. Prometheus Control, I'm beginning my approach now. I need you to have your first group of 22 personnel ready for immediate boarding at your lowest accessible deck. This is going to be fast and dangerous. Anyone who can't move quickly needs to go in the first load. Elena banked the Albatross into a steep descending turn, using techniques that Chief Warrant Officer Salt Mackenzie had taught her for extreme weather water landings. The key was reading the wave patterns and timing the touchdown for the brief moment when a wave's backside created a relatively flat surface. Miss that timing by even a few seconds, and the aircraft would either be driven into the water by a wave crest or launched airborne by an unexpected swell. The approach was a masterpiece of seat-of-the-pants flying. Elena descended through wind shear that varied from 80 to 180 miles per hour, using the Albatross's robust control authority to maintain a glide path that conventional aircraft computers would have declared impossible. She could see the platform's emergency crew watching her approach with expressions that she imagined ranged from hope to disbelief. No one had expected a rescue aircraft to appear in the middle of Hurricane Delilah, especially not a vintage flying boat that officially existed only in museums and maintenance records. Elena touched down on the backside of a 40-foot swell, the Albatross's deep V-hull cutting through the water with the authority of a design that had been perfected through decades of heavy weather operations. The aircraft immediately began the violent motion that characterized water operations in extreme seas, but Elena had expected this and was already maneuvering toward the platform's emergency boat landing. The platform personnel had prepared for her arrival with the efficiency of people who understood that their lives depended on speed and precision. Elena could see them assembled on the platform's lowest intact deck, their survival suits bright against the gray metal structure. The platform supervisor's voice crackled through her headset with urgent coordination information. Coast Guard 2147. We have the first 22 personnel ready for immediate boarding. These are our injured and mobility-impaired individuals, plus essential technical personnel with platform shutdown codes. Can you maintain position against this sea state? Elena wrestled with the Albatross's controls as 40-foot swells tried to drive the aircraft away from the platform or slam it into the structure support columns. The flying boat was designed for exactly this type of operation, but maintaining precise position in mountainous seas required every technique Elena had learned during her 17 previous rescue missions. Prometheus, I can hold position for approximately 4 minutes before fuel consumption and structural stress require departure. Get your people aboard now. The evacuation proceeded with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that failure meant death. Platform personnel formed a human chain to transfer the injured and immobile survivors into the Albatross's passenger compartment, while Elena fought to keep the aircraft steady against waves that threatened to overwhelm even her considerable piloting skills. Each person who made it aboard represented a victory against odds that everyone had declared impossible. With 22 survivors secure in the passenger compartment, Elena executed a takeoff that pushed both her skills and the aircraft's capabilities beyond their documented limits. The Albatross labored into the air, carrying more weight than its designers had ever intended, its engines straining against the combined forces of hurricane winds and maximum payload. But the aircraft held together, its 40-year-old engineering proving superior to modern designs that relied on perfect conditions and computer optimization. The flight back to Meridian Station was a nightmare of turbulence and navigation challenges. But Elena had accomplished the impossible. She had reached the Prometheus platform, evacuated 22 people in conditions that had grounded every other rescue asset, and proven that old-fashioned aviation courage could still triumph over modern bureaucratic limitations. But as she established radio contact with Meridian Base to report her success, Elena realized that her mission was only 1/3 complete. 45 people remained on the platform. The structure was continuing to deteriorate, and she had perhaps enough fuel for 2 more evacuation flights before the Albatross would be unable to continue operations. Meridian Base, this is Coast Guard 2147 with 22 survivors aboard. I am returning for second evacuation flight. 31 minutes remain until platform collapse, and I estimate 45 personnel still require evacuation. Prometheus platform structural condition is critical. This will be very close. Behind her, 22 people owed their lives to a decision that everyone had called impossible. Ahead of her, 45 more waited to discover whether individual expertise and determination could overcome institutional failure and meteorological fury. Elena banked the overloaded Albatross toward Meridian Station and prepared for the 2 most important flights of her career. Elena taxied the overloaded Albatross toward Meridian Station's emergency ramp with 22 survivors packed into a passenger compartment designed for routine cargo transport. Through her rain-streaked windscreen, she could see the entire base mobilized in response to her unauthorized departure emergency vehicles, medical personnel, and what appeared to be every off-duty officer on the installation standing in the driving rain to witness her return. The scene at the emergency ramp was controlled chaos. Ambulances were positioned in formation, their emergency lights creating strange patterns in the storm-driven darkness. Medical teams in rain gear waited beside stretchers and emergency equipment, while base personnel struggled to secure ground support equipment against Hurricane Delilah's continued assault on the facility. Elena brought the Albatross to a stop and shut down the engines, feeling the sudden silence that comes after hours of radial engine noise. But the silence was immediately filled by the sound of organized rescue activity, the voices of medical personnel, the mechanical sounds of emergency equipment, and the underlying roar of a hurricane that showed no signs of diminishing. The passenger door opened and Elena watched as base medical teams began the careful process of evacuating survivors from the aircraft's cramped interior. Each person who emerged represented a direct contradiction to everything that Commander Hartwell and his staff had declared impossible just 2 hours earlier. These weren't theoretical casualties or statistical projections. They were living, breathing human beings whose survival proved that institutional limitations were often nothing more than failures of imagination and courage. Elena remained in the cockpit, monitoring radio communications and calculating fuel consumption for her return flights. The Albatross had consumed more fuel than projected due to the extreme weather conditions and the stress of operating at maximum weight. But her calculations showed that 2 more evacuation flights were still possible if she pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits. Commander Hartwell approached the aircraft, flanked by Major Caldwell and Lieutenant Commander Reeves, but their expressions had undergone a dramatic transformation. The anger and bureaucratic certainty that had characterized their earlier confrontation had been replaced by something Elena hadn't seen from them in 18 months, professional respect mixed with obvious bewilderment. "Captain Vasquez," Hartwell called through the cockpit window, his voice barely audible over the storm's continued fury. "We need to debrief immediately. How many personnel remain on the platform, and what are the conditions for additional evacuation flights?" Elena opened the cockpit window, feeling Hurricane Delilah's wind and rain invade the aircraft's interior. "Sir, 45. Personnel remain on the Prometheus platform. Platform structural condition is deteriorating rapidly. My estimate is 26 minutes until catastrophic collapse. I have sufficient fuel for 2 more evacuation flights if we execute them immediately." Major Caldwell stepped closer to the aircraft, his previous hostility replaced by urgent professional concern. "Captain, what are the operational parameters for additional flights? We need to coordinate ground support, medical response, and communication protocols for maximum efficiency." Elena stared at the Major in disbelief. 2 hours earlier, he had been questioning her mental stability and threatening her with arrest. Now he was asking for operational guidance on executing rescue missions that he had declared impossible. The transformation was so complete that Elena wondered if she was experiencing some kind of storm-induced hallucination. "Major," she replied, her voice carrying a note of steel that reflected 18 months of accumulated frustration. "The operational parameters are exactly what I described in the briefing room when you dismissed my recommendations as the fantasies of an unqualified support technician. The Albatross can land in 40-foot seas, evacuate 22 passengers per flight, and operate in wind conditions that ground every other aircraft in our inventory." Lieutenant Commander Reeves moved to Elena's other side, her rain-soaked uniform and urgent expression contrasting sharply with the condescending dismissal she had shown earlier. "Captain Vasquez, we need you to execute those additional flights immediately. The base medical facilities are prepared to handle mass casualties, and we've established direct communication links with the platform emergency control system." Elena felt a surge of bitter vindication at hearing her expertise suddenly valued by the same people who had spent 2 hours questioning her judgment and qualifications. But the lives of 45 trapped personnel took precedence over personal satisfaction, so she focused on the operational requirements for completing the mission. "I need immediate fuel service, a mechanical inspection of critical systems, and clearance for immediate departure," Elena said, climbing down from the cockpit to supervise the rapid turnaround process. "Every minute we spend on the ground is a minute we can't recover at the platform." The response was immediate and comprehensive. Ground crews who had been positioned to arrest Elena for theft of government property were now working frantically to service her aircraft and ensure maximum operational readiness. Fuel trucks positioned themselves alongside the Albatross, while maintenance technicians began rapid inspections of systems that had been stressed beyond normal limits during the first evacuation flight. Elena watched the transformation with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal bitterness. The same institutional machinery that had dismissed her recommendations and questioned her competence was now mobilizing with impressive efficiency to support the mission she had been forced to execute without authorization. The irony was profound. She had been right about everything, but institutional authority had required proof of success before acknowledging the validity of her expertise. Commander Hartwell approached Elena directly, his expression showing the kind of humility that comes from having one's professional judgment thoroughly contradicted by events. "Captain Vasquez, I want you to know that your actions today represent the finest traditions of Coast Guard rescue operations. Your willingness to risk everything to save those personnel is exactly the kind of courage that defines our service." Elena stared at the commander in stunned silence. This was the same man who had ordered her confined to quarters and threatened her with court-martial less than 3 hours earlier. Now he was praising her courage and invoking the finest traditions of the Coast Guard, the same traditions he had used to justify preventing her from executing the rescue mission in the first place. "Sir," Elena replied, her voice carefully neutral despite the emotions churning inside her. "I appreciate your support, but 45 people are still trapped on that platform. We can discuss the traditions of Coast Guard rescue operations after we've finished saving lives." The fuel service completed in record time, with ground crews working in conditions that would normally have grounded all support operations. Elena completed her pre-flight inspection while base personnel loaded additional emergency medical supplies and communication equipment into the aircraft. The efficiency was impressive, but Elena couldn't help noting that the same sense of urgency could have been applied 2 hours earlier if anyone had been willing to listen to solutions that challenged conventional thinking. Elena climbed back into the cockpit and began the engine startup sequence for her second evacuation flight. Through the cockpit windows, she could see dozens of base personnel watching her departure with expressions that ranged from admiration to disbelief. These were the same people who had questioned her qualifications and dismissed her expertise, now gathered to witness the successful execution of missions they had declared impossible. The radio crackled with Commander Hartwell's voice as Elena taxied toward the runway. "Coast Guard 2147. You are cleared for immediate departure with priority handling for all air traffic control services. The entire base is behind you, Captain. Bring those people home." Elena keyed her microphone, knowing that this conversation would be recorded and analyzed by investigators seeking to understand how institutional failure had nearly resulted in the death of 67 innocent people. "Meridian Base. This is Coast Guard 2147. I am departing for the second evacuation flight. 24 minutes remain until platform collapse." As the Albatross lifted off into Hurricane Delilah's continuing fury, Elena realized that she had achieved something more significant than just rescuing 22 people. She had forced an entire military installation to confront the difference between institutional authority and individual competence, between bureaucratic caution and operational courage. The vindication was complete, but Elena knew that her real victory wouldn't be measured in career advancement or official recognition. It would be measured in the lives of people who went home to their families because someone had been willing to trust old-fashioned aviation skill over modern institutional limitations. 6 months after Hurricane Delilah, Captain Elena Vasquez stood in the newly constructed Advanced Maritime Rescue Training Center at Meridian Coast Guard Station, watching as the latest class of rescue pilots practiced extreme weather water landing techniques in the fully restored HU-16 Albatross. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as scrap metal now served as the centerpiece of a revolutionary training program that had attracted aviation experts from around the world. The transformation had been as dramatic as it was inevitable. Within 48 hours of Elena's successful rescue of all 67 personnel from the Prometheus platform, the Coast Guard's highest leadership had arrived at Meridian Station to conduct what they diplomatically termed a comprehensive review of operational capabilities and institutional decision-making processes. The review had resulted in the largest reorganization of Coast Guard rescue operations in decades. Elena now held the position of Director of Extreme Weather Rescue Operations, a newly created role that gave her authority over training programs, equipment procurement, and operational protocols for missions that pushed beyond conventional limitations. The bureaucratic exile that had lasted 18 months had been replaced by institutional recognition that her expertise represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking the service needed. But the changes went far deeper than individual career advancement. The Albatross had been completely restored to full operational status, its vintage systems upgraded with modern communication and navigation equipment, while retaining the analog flight controls and mechanical reliability that had made the rescue mission possible. 3 additional HU-16 aircraft had been located and brought back to service, creating a specialized fleet capable of operations that conventional aircraft couldn't attempt. Elena walked through the training center's simulation facility, where young pilots practiced the techniques that Chief Warrant Officer Salt Mackenzie had taught her decades earlier. The curriculum now included extensive instruction in analog navigation, mechanical systems management, and the kind of seat-of-the-pants flying that modern aviation had largely abandoned in favor of computer-controlled precision. The key principle, Elena explained to her current class of 12 pilots, is understanding that extreme rescue operations often require you to operate beyond published limitations. Your aircraft's capabilities aren't defined by what the manual says is possible. They're defined by what physics and engineering make survivable. Lieutenant Sarah Chun raised her hand, her face showing the kind of intense focus that characterized pilots who understood they were learning skills that could mean the difference between life and death. Captain, how do you make the decision to exceed operational parameters? The manual says one thing, but the mission requires something else. Elena smiled, recognizing in the young pilot the same question she had wrestled with throughout her career. Lieutenant, the manual is written for normal conditions and risk-averse administrators. When people are dying and conventional options have been exhausted, you have to trust your training, your equipment, and your willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. The classroom fell silent as Elena's words sank in. These pilots had all heard the official account of Hurricane Delilah, how institutional failure had nearly resulted in the death of 67 people, and how one pilot's willingness to act outside established protocols had saved lives that everyone else had written off as acceptable casualties. Elena moved to the large display screen that showed the technical specifications of the Albatross, its performance data, and the weather conditions that had existed during Hurricane Delilah. The aircraft sitting in Hangar 7 wasn't obsolete or inadequate. It was misunderstood by people who had forgotten that aviation is fundamentally about human skill applied through mechanical systems. When you rely too heavily on computers and automated systems, you lose the ability to improvise, adapt, and overcome. Captain David Rodriguez, one of Elena's former colleagues who had undergone his own professional transformation, approached the front of the classroom. Captain Vasquez, the Prometheus rescue has become legendary throughout the Coast Guard, but beyond the immediate mission success, what long-term changes do you see in how we approach rescue operations? Elena considered the question, thinking about the broader implications of what had happened during Hurricane Delilah. Captain Rodriguez, I think we've learned that institutional wisdom isn't always wise, and that individual expertise can be more valuable than collective judgment. The Coast Guard has always prided itself on improvisation and courage, but somewhere along the way, we started prioritizing procedures over people and regulations over results. She gestured toward the window where the restored Albatross was visible. On the training ramp, its classic lines contrasting with the sleek modern helicopters parked nearby. That aircraft represents a different philosophy of aviation, one that trusts pilot judgment over computer algorithms, mechanical reliability over electronic sophistication, and proven performance over theoretical specifications. It's not about rejecting modern technology. It's about maintaining the skills and equipment necessary to operate when modern technology fails. The discussion continued for another hour, with Elena sharing insights that had been earned through years of operational flying and 18 months of bureaucratic exile. The young pilots asked probing questions about decision-making under pressure, resource management in extreme conditions, and the psychological challenges of operating outside established protocols. As the class ended and the pilots departed for their practical flying exercises, Elena remained in the classroom, reviewing the training materials that would shape the next generation of Coast Guard rescue aviators. The curriculum now included extensive study of the Hurricane Delilah incident, not as a celebration of individual heroism, but as a case study in institutional failure and the importance of maintaining diverse capabilities. Elena's computer chimed. with an encrypted message from Coast Guard headquarters, and she smiled as she read the contents. The service had received formal requests from the Canadian Coast Guard, the Royal Navy, and the Australian Maritime Safety Authority for training exchanges focused on extreme weather rescue operations. The techniques and philosophy that had once been dismissed as obsolete were now being studied and implemented by maritime rescue services around the world. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. For 18 months, she had been treated as a relic from aviation's past, someone whose expertise was no longer relevant to modern operations. Now, rescue services globally were recognizing that her approach represented aviation's future, a return to the fundamental principles of pilot skill, mechanical reliability, and operational flexibility that had made aviation rescue possible. In the first place, Elena walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where the Albatross was being prepared for an afternoon training flight. The aircraft looked exactly as it had 6 months earlier, but everything else had changed. The base that had once questioned her competence now sought her guidance on operational matters. The officers who had dismissed her recommendations now implemented her training programs. The institution that had exiled her to administrative duties now relied on her expertise to prepare the next generation of rescue pilots. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from a different source entirely. In her office safe, she kept 67 letters from the people who had been rescued from the Prometheus platform: engineers, technicians, administrative staff, and contractors who had returned to their families because someone had been willing to trust old-fashioned aviation courage over modern institutional limitations. Each letter told a personal story of survival, but collectively they represented something more significant: proof that individual expertise and determination could overcome institutional failure, that quiet conviction could achieve more than loud authority, and that sometimes the most important missions couldn't wait for permission. Elena Vasquez had saved 67 lives during Hurricane Delilah, but her larger victory was proving that the human element remained the most crucial component of aviation rescue operations. In an age of computer-controlled aircraft and automated systems, she had demonstrated that there was still a place for pilots who understood that flying was fundamentally about human skill applied through mechanical systems to accomplish the impossible. The scrap metal had become the foundation of a revolution in maritime rescue operations, and the pilot everyone had dismissed had become the architect of that revolution. Sometimes the most important victories were achieved not by following established procedures, but by having the courage to trust experience, expertise, and the quiet conviction that saving lives was more important than preserving careers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.